My name is Botha, and it's my pleasure to document the history of the James 127 Trust. The Trust was founded on the 11th of October 2004, and it is a social enterprise working in the field of social innovation and entrepreneurship. We are focused as a mandate to provide holistic care for orphans and vulnerable children and youth that are made vulnerable, marginalized and suffering in the context of HIV and AIDS and poverty. So the Trust, really the inspiration for the Trust began probably around 2000. I was at the time a diplomat, a South African diplomat posted to Paris, France, and I was invited to go and speak at a small fundraising function in Oxford, England, and I was asked to speak about orphans and vulnerable children, and I went prepared with a poem from Yeats about the second coming, when things fall apart and the centre cannot hold. Really a symbolism of when the mother dies, the family literally fall apart. And I also went with the inspiration of the little boy giving Jesus the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and how he took it, blessed it, and a miracle of multiplication took place. During the talk that I gave, I was really struck by the enormity of the problem of orphan and vulnerable children. South Africa at the time had the largest number of people living with HIV in the world. At the time, there was also serious challenges around rollout of antiretroviral treatment, and the number of children being orphaned and born with HIV was astronomical. Today we know that at least 1 in 5 children are orphaned, and many of these children are orphaned as a result of the epidemic. On the way back from England, I was reflecting at what really is God's response, because it seemed to me that the enemy of God and the enemies of God were mocking and saying, "Where is your God in the face of such devastation?" And I was reflecting and thinking, God, what is your response? And during this reflection, I had a vision. I had a picture of children standing in the throne room. And I was standing there, and I was wearing white linen, shimmering white linen. And the children asked the Lord, why did the suffering happen to them? Why did the extent of devastation, trauma, why did it occur? And there was a pause, and then God responded with an echo of Scripture. And the Scripture was an outline of the ethics found in His Word, the ethics for living life, ethics for relationships, ethics for marriage, ethics for family. And then there was another pause, and then the children asked the Lord, but where were you when we needed you? And I felt the Lord looking at me. Of course, He was not only looking at me, He was looking at all of us. He was also looking at you. So in a sense, my life became a message that God is a father to the fatherless, and that we will really give an account one day in heaven when we will be asked, but where were you, Lord? And I must say, I will be able to say, Lord, I did respond. And so really the genesis of the Trust was a response to the James 127 scripture that states that true religion, undefiled before the Father, is to care for orphans and widows and to refuse to let the world corrupt you. And so here we have this amazing bringing together of the ethic of care of the vulnerable and a refusal to be corrupted. And I think this is quite a critical message for South Africa today, the ethic of caring and the ethic of refusing to be corrupted. And the real genesis, the beginning of a response, is rooted in the miracle of the multiplication of giving Jesus the 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so the inspiration for the trust really began out of a mandate of bringing about a multiplication, a multiple response. And so I started to work with the anti-apartheid movement in Paris and really start gathering best practice and information and knowledge on how to respond. And I worked with the faith-based sector and the socialists and communists and social activists. So it was a really eclectic mix of faith and political people working together for social justice. And these French citizens had spent decades in actually supporting the anti-apartheid movement. Some had even been imprisoned and taken great risk and sacrifice in their lives. So it was such a privilege to work with them. So in 2004, when I returned to South Africa, I had the scripture in my head and best practice from working with this group. And so the James 1:27 Trust was born and launched. And the original vision and mission is something that we are still serving 10 years later. So this recording is really a marker to indicate what really has happened the last 10 years. So in the beginning, we were inspired by caring for children in their families. There was already an international move against institutional care, and the whole idea of orphanages and children's homes had by then already been accepted by practitioners working in the vulnerable child sector as really not good practice. The main reason being that the stigma associated with living in these homes remained with the children even long after their adult life. So the idea was to work rather with foster homes and keep children in their communities and to keep their lives as normal as possible without labeling and stigma and bring further entrenching identifying them as orphans. So this was quite an important departure. The United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which all the nations of the world, with the exception of Sudan and the United States, are signatories to. We also have signed this convention and our parliament has ratified it. So the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child provide 41 articles that set out the guidelines for working with children's rights. And the African Charter on the Rights of the Child also extend these to the responsibilities. So in South Africa, with the Children's Act, we have a very good framework in which to work. So the James 1:7 Trust works with community-based organizations where we work with children in their families and in their communities. So the methodology that we use is asset-based community development, where we look for what is already inherent in the community, what assets and resources are there, and then we work with those in order to bring about a response. So the response typically is to map the vulnerability in the community, the needs and the assets and resources, and then through a kind of relational framework, relational thinking approach, and through participation, we identify with the community what exactly they would like to do. And so we then start to formulate a response where we identify child-headed households and very vulnerable families, and then we, from that vulnerability, start to develop a care plan. And then with that care plan, we develop a intervention and a implementation and a evaluation strategy. And to do that on a much bigger scale, we have had to use technology. So the social innovation idea is that there is already enough assets and thinking and ability within the community, but one needs to just enable that to come forward and bring that out in order for the community to care for their own children. And that, as the African idiom states, it takes a village to grow a child. We are then linking the local village with the global village. And so you have the global village and the local village working together to care. And this is really the innovation, social innovation that we're doing. The social entrepreneurship is that this response of care is really framed within goods and services and products that are the care of the community is then commercialized, monetized, and productized, and then sold on a social market. So this technical response really provides the environment for a sustainable long-term intervention. The entrepreneurship has to scale, has to be framed within an enterprise architecture. All big organizations have to have proper business disciplines: HR, finance, legal, marketing, operations, project management, and governance. And this enterprise architecture, as it is for big corporates, is exactly applicable also to the not-for-profit sector, the NGOs. So this is really what the Trust is doing. So 10 years later, we have, at the moment, we have several families where we are providing holistic care, and we are also working with about 380 children within our care circle of care influence, where we are moving from emergency relief to rehabilitation to development to autonomy. And we are working with these children in the domains of emotional care, social, psychological, physical, where we look at shelter and food and nutrition, and cognitive, which is educational, scholastic. So typically we would work with schools, and then from try and facilitate feeding programs, and then from there identify the vulnerable households, and also work with creches and early childhood development. The age group 4 to 6 is very vulnerable, and it's where the building blocks for literacy and numeracy is laid. So all in all, we feel tactically that the age group 4 to 14 is important, because that is where worldview is formed. So after 10 years, the Trust, in terms of impact, we are probably the first NGO in the world to be using life cycle technology, where we manage the development process within the life cycle. And we're the first NGO in Africa to be using ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning tools, and we're using SAP, we're using their technology, and we're also implementing performance management technology through SuccessFactors, and we're using EpiServer 7 for our content management. So when all is said and done, the question is, are the children being transformed? And are their lives being changed? And the answer is yes and no. We have learned, when we say we are learning, it means we are unlearning all the time. We are learning that there's a dance and there's a choice. So just as there's a dream for each person and each child, and the dance helps to facilitate that dream, each child and each person has sovereignty and exercise choice. And in some families, there are choices made that we cannot prevent the destruction that comes. But there are some circumstances where the choices are for life and for blessing, and we celebrate those. And it's an incredible privilege to actually partner with God in this dance and this message of hope. Probably lessons learned. What I've really learned is that we are becoming and have to become the transformation that we want to see. So it is the pressure to be transformed individually is immense in order to cope with the brokenness of the communities that we are working and serving in. Coming from privilege and coming from a resourced environment where there seems innate privilege is very difficult to change, and it's taken a long time to listen and to know that we don't have all the answers and not everything has to be fixed. But what's really more important is the relational proximity of being present, caring, suffering, feeling, having empathy and compassion, and connected. And this connectedness is a sanctuary for God. God uses that as a place and a space for His own Spirit to be present. And this is such an awesome privilege. So if you've been patient and had the stamina to listen through this meander, my words of encouragement to you are that it might well be part of your dream, of the dreamer, to participate in serving the dream of these children. God bless you.